guys, it's Kate and I hope you're having a great day. I'm back with another watercolor tutorial with the palette knife painting technique. So there's a few different ideas I wanted to share with you on how you can incorporate a palette knife into your watercolor, and I'm going to try a couple of different things and show you what they look like and what the differences are. So I'm working with my Winsor & Newton Cotman color set. This is the field set, and I also have 3 tubes. So I have this here just so I can use the mixing well pretty much, but I've got Payne's Gray, Burnt Umber, and Purple Lake. And so I wanted to show you some things you can do with palette knives when you have just the paint in tubes and it's already moist. But I'll also be able to show you some things that you can do with just the paint from your palette as well in a more liquid form. So I'm just squeezing out a little bit of paint in my palette up there, and up in this area I'm going to do wet on dry. And first I'm going to do my small palette knife, and this is a great way to get some thick color of paint on your paper. So one thing is to add some texture, like let's say I wanted to do a tree trunk, and as you can see I'm just getting a very little bit onto my palette knife, and you can kind of drag it across almost like you do with acrylic paint, and you can get some really wonderful texture on there. And I can kind of come down on this other side with a line, and you can kind of do a tree trunk like that. You can get pretty thick also and make sort of like these thick, almost impasto blobs, and you can drag, and you can also do different lines with your palette knife. So I could do some pretty thick applications just like this, and that might be good for branches and twigs, maybe some dried grasses, things like that, if you're into landscapes. But there's a lot of different things you can do. You can also use different palette knives that have some textured edges, like this one or possibly this one, and I'll just grab this for right now. But if you have that, you can do some other types of marks and just play around with it and have fun. So I'm going to spray this a little bit while it's still wet so you can see how it actually spreads out once you add water. So I have my spray bottle here, and I'm just going to give it a couple of squirts, and you can see, you know, when watercolor gets activated, when it gets wet, it does spread out, and you can see the difference between wet on dry and wet on wet. So I'm going to give it 5 sprays just to kind of keep things even, and you can see it start to spread, but you can also see it sort of keeping its place. So I'm going to leave that to dry. I'm not going to touch it or use my brush or anything like that. Next, I'm going to do the same thing but with wet on wet. So I'm going to take my brush and dip it in water and get it good and saturated. And I'm just going to brush it onto this paper here so that we have a nice wet coat. Actually, let me just blot this because it's starting to go into my paper. So I'm just going to dry that and send it back a little bit. And I just want to keep this by itself. So I'm going to come back in with some water here and get it moist. Okay, we've got our paper nice and wet. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to grab some paint on my palette knife here. Just a little bit again on the edge. And I'm going to come in and do that tree trunk. And you can see how as you're rubbing it down, it starts to saturate already. And so let me do some lines here. And you can see how it disperses much faster, but you do still have some of those texture marks that stay in there. Now I'm going to come in with the thicker dollops of paint, and then I'll kind of rub this out a bit, and you can see what the effect is there. Okay, now I'm getting just the excess off. Now another thing you can do is scraping. So if I wanted to go in here, there's a couple of things I can do. So I'm going to scrape up some more paint and rub this in and get it a pretty good little coat going. I can come in here and scrape it just like that, like you would with acrylic. Okay, and I can do scraping with actual paint. So this is not painting so much with a tube paint, but if I were to come right into my pan and get some of that purpley pink color, that is the Purple Lake, and let's say I wanted to paint this little area here. I can actually use my palette knife to scrape marks into my paint and create texture that way. So I've got, again, my palette knife, and I'm going to put some scratch marks in here. And what happens is kind of a similar effect, but exactly the opposite. I'm scraping into wet paint here that is thick to reveal the lighter paper underneath. And here I'm scraping into wet paint that's already been diluted and painted on the page. And it actually will settle into your creases and become darker so that the sediment all goes in there. Now another thing you can do is just some general mark making. If I wanted, I could mix a color into my palette, and just like I would any other normal watercolor. Okay, get myself a good coat going, or a good puddle going in here. And I can use my different palette knives to make marks with. So I'll go back to this one. I can come in here and almost stamp with it. And this is not limited to palette knives. I can do this with really anything, but watercolor is wonderful to stamp with, and you can do it with multiple colors. So I've got some purple down, but let me wet this burnt umber down a bit and dilute this almost like you would have paint from the pan. And I can come back in with my palette knife again and make some more marks. And I can do that with just about any tool that I want to. Let me grab this. All right. Come back in with my flat one. I can come and do some lines still, but it won't be as thick of an application as what we have over here. So I can still paint with a palette knife with liquid paint as well. It's just going to behave differently, basically. And I can even put, let's say, a little bit of a wash right here. Oops. Okay, and then I can come back in with my purple and do a mark right into it. And it will spread as if I put it down with a brush. It will slowly dissolve into the rest of the paint and combine. So I'm going to put this aside to dry and show you just another couple of things. You can combine palette knife painting and paintbrush painting. So I'm going to grab all three of my colors here. And I'm going to start with my Payne's Gray. Okay, I'm going to squirt some right out onto my palette knife. and get it kind of thick. All right. I'm going to get my burnt umber and do the same. And I've got just a little bit right there. And put this in right with that Payne's Gray. Just like that. And then I'm going to go into my Purple Lake tube. All right. Now what you can do is when you have those really thick layers of colors, sometimes it can be kind of fun to make sort of a blobby mix right there on the page. You're not mixing them, but you're going to let the water do the mixing. So I'm going to load up my brush and get this paper down here wet. And I've got just a little bit of burnt umber on my paintbrush still, but that's okay. Okay, I'm going to get it wet underneath. And now I'm going to bring this up into my paint. I'm going to grab some more water and just keep coming up in there. And I'm dampening the bottom of this paint to get it activated. And then I can pick it up and let it flow down. And I can kind of help it along here if I want. Just like this. And look at this amazing rainbow, just with 3 colors. And I can even drop in more water where I want to, and just let that spread. And it's a really beautiful effect. And I'm going to wipe off some of this excess water here at the bottom. And let this continue. Now I'm going to let this dry, let everything dry, and come back and show you the finished result. Okay, we are all dry except for just a couple of the small places where I had the bigger blobs from my palette knife, but for how the paint will look when it's dry, we're there. So this is where we made that rainbow where we painted across on the top with the palette knife. I'm going to bring you in for a close-up so you can see that beautiful thick paint at the top that's almost black in some areas, even though we didn't use any, and how it blends together beautifully when you add water to it and it comes down the page. This is great for some of those really just great abstract paintings, landscapes. If you want something with a lot of atmosphere, you can really do some wonderful effects even with just a single color. If you lay on the paint thick and then add water till it flows in a certain direction, it's just really beautiful. And then here is our wet on dry and wet on wet. And so you can see with the wet on wet, it spreads, and so does the wet on dry when you spray it with water. But if you notice, especially with the tree trunks, there's much more definition that stays after spraying it versus putting it in wet paper that's already been moistened. Here is our mark making with our palette knives, and you can see the really interesting effects you can get there. And then we have our scraping, so you can see how it dries and the color sinks into those ridges made by the palette knife. And you can use any scraping tool. I used a palette knife in this video, but you can use a stylus. You can use any type of mark making tool that you like. Same thing with this. This is just a thin coat of our plain watercolor from the tube, and then we scraped a palette knife in it to scrape back some of the paint to let the paper that's lighter come through. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with palette knives and watercolor. Even if you might not think they go together, they can go together really well. And so if you got some ideas from this, I hope you'll start to use that a little bit in your painting. And I hope you like this video today. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, keep creating.